Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and I wanted to take just a few moments to share with you from my perspective this week about the materials that you are reading. I don't think many of us realize very clearly the timeline in the post-revolution era, but the war actually ended 1781, which is the time period that your studies start here. And then it was about 2 years, 1783, before we get a treaty with the British. And so from there until the Constitution is finally, endorsed by the states, that's 1789, we have a roughly 10-year period in which the states or the colonies were kind of in limbo. And what happened is that many of them went back and started their own mini countries. They developed and experimented with legislatures. Some of them did a monocameral type of setup where you had a leader and one body. Most of them had a bicameral legislation. And when they came together finally in 1787, it really was over the failure of the Articles of Confederation to adequately do what they needed to do, namely to raise the funds to pay off their war indebtedness. And they did owe a great deal of money to the founding fathers, many of whom put their own personal fortunes at stake. They owed money to France and some other countries that did help. And so three of the states did pay off their portion of the war debt during this time. And so that added another layer of disagreement when these men came together in 1787 to discuss how they would change the Articles of Confederation, or if they would just abandon them altogether and go a new route. They fairly rapidly chose to abandon the Articles of Confederation and to discuss the setting up of a country. And it's interesting to note Benjamin Franklin was there. We do get some personal commentary from him on two particular things. Number one, he steps out of the meeting in Philadelphia on the street, and somebody apparently asked him, "Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us?" And he says, a republic, sir, if you can keep it. They debated whether to do a democracy. And of course, democracy, in the Western world, the only real true democracy, one man, one vote, would have been Athens, Greece, way back in the past history. Another interesting idea that has come up is that they were influenced by the Iroquois Confederacy in the northern parts of New York, who did operate pretty much as a democratic form of government. This confederacy were several tribes that came together, and they each appointed certain leaders to meet as a part of the confederacy. And it was in some respects a true democracy or a true republic as a model. And I think Franklin again mentions that somewhere, that they actually talked about that in the meetings. They discussed everything from making George Washington a king and setting up his family as royalty to whatever, the presidents. And these states did bring their examples with them. New Jersey brought a bicameral plan to have two bodies and one president, or a monocameral plan, I'm sorry, one body and one president. And Virginia brought the winning plan, which was a bicameral with one president. And so you will notice going forward in all of this that Virginia is going to have a lot of influence in the founding of the new country. Many of our first presidents, from Washington to Jefferson to Monroe to Madison, all come from Virginia. They came to be called the Virginia Cadre. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was not there for the Constitution, and that's one thing that most people don't think about and don't realize. Jefferson was actually in France while they were working on the Constitution, and he is our diplomat there. And in 1789, when the French Revolution starts, Jefferson's still there. And what's really interesting is if you examine the document, that was the document of the French Revolution, it is vintage Jefferson on the rights of men and nations. And there is a story, however, probably not documented, that Jefferson was on the wall of the Bastille that morning on July the 14th, 1789, when they overthrew the Bastille to get weapons, and the French Revolution was underway. Another thing we don't talk very much about is the influence of the French Revolution on America in 1789. America is kind of it is the first country to rebel against its leaders and to have a revolution and overthrow the leaders. And what's really interesting is that others take hope from that, take interest in that. And so we become the spark that sets off revolutions that are going to happen first in France, then all through South America, up until about 1850. And it reminded you of what Ahmadinejad, the leader of Iran, said after the Iranians had overthrown the Shah. He says, we are masters at revolution. We'll be glad to help you. If you want to revolt in your country, just call us and we'll come over and help you. Well, there was a lot of things that are going on with the French Revolution that America was hip deep in. There was Citizen Guadet who came to America and tried to enlist followers to come and join the revolution. Of course, Jefferson was very much pro French Revolution, and some of the others were anti. So this led to a lot of animosity among the leaders. So at any rate, 1787, they passed the Constitution. There is some concern that they cannot get it past the states for ratification. And so they go back and add the Bill of Rights late in the game to the Constitution, guaranteeing Americans basic rights. And this was of great importance. And so finally, 1789, the ratification happened. Enough states ratified to where it became the law of the land. There were states who never did ratify. Of the 13 colonies that did not ever ratify the Constitution. New York was about the last one, and there was some discussion there and some holding of breath that they wouldn't do it. And it did, it wasn't a given, it wasn't a foregone conclusion. As we've said about the revolution to begin with, this is a great experiment. There were people, America was split about 50-50, about 50% were loyal to England, became known as the Loyalists. They mounted a division of troops that the Loyalists did that supported Great Britain and fought with Great Britain. And then, of course, as many of them left after the war, they went to Canada or other British holdings or back to England, but they did not want to stay or live in this America that was a bunch of revolutionaries and rebels. Interestingly enough, the preacher, John Wesley, who had been here quite often with George Whitefield and brought about the Great Awakening in the New England colonies and down the coast, never came back to America again. He was so against the American Revolution. Francis Asbury, his assistant here, literally became the father of American Methodism because he took over the reins and Wesley wouldn't come back. So basically, there's a lot of feelings on both sides of the issue. And that would remain. America, when we get to the latter part, 1820s, is where America begins to think of itself as Americans and no longer as British subjects. After the Revolutionary War, England kept kind of badgering and stopping ships and taking men out that had a British accent and impressing them into labor on their ships and taking them God knows where. That was a major reason for Madison declaring war on Great Britain in the War of 1812. 1812 war was really interesting. It was the war nobody remembers. We didn't win but one land battle, and that was the Battle of New Orleans. It was led by Andrew Jackson, and technically it was fought after the Treaty of Ghent was signed. So we're not real sure whether Jackson knew the war was over and he went ahead and fought the battle anyway, or else he didn't know. Knowing Jackson, I kind of tend to think he did know and pushed ahead with it anyways, but that was the only land battle. We did win some great sea battles. We did get some great songs out of the war, but the Americans don't particularly want to remember the War of 1812. The British certainly don't want to remember it because they lost yet again. And this ended their presence in North America pretty much. The Canadians do remember the War of 1812 because it became their war of independence from England. And of course, they became a part of the Commonwealth, but as a free country. So all these things kind of mesh together. I think they're of interest, and I would appreciate hearing from you as to your thoughts on the matter. If there's anything there that kind of whets your appetite and and makes you want to respond. Thanks so much, and we will talk to you next time.